You are listening to the ERP, Organizational Change Journal, a podcast brought to you by Nestell and Associates.
The next question here in your book, and again, for our listeners, we're talking about the secret sauce for leading transformational change. There's many factors shared throughout your book that leaders deploy, right? And just to share some with our listeners, this includes terms such as set a new vision, mission, or sense of purpose, drive culture change and innovation, build a new team, insisted on collaboration, held people accountable, communicated more transparently, made people feel like owners, recognized change champions, built trust, took risk, learned from failures. And it seems to me a common theme, Ian, throughout the book is that the successful transformational leaders are quite reflective. And you also mentioned in your book that every leader learned from both what they did and what they did not do. So I guess my question is reflection a natural thing for leaders, or does it come with intent in practice, or is it somehow a lesson learned? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start with the premise that it's really not natural for most people. And so it's more rare than it is common. But, not to sound too cynical, I would say that the leaders who are more reflective, who learn from experience and mistakes, like we were just talking about with failures, and encourage other people to do the same, are almost always going to be, especially over the long term, much more successful at leading change than people who are much less reflective, because those less reflective people, as we saw over and over again, tended not to learn from mistakes, tended to repeat them, tended to blame other people for them, and tended to, almost dismiss things that didn't work as somehow the fault of the process or other people or lack of resources. It was almost other focused. It's almost always other focused. It's some other reason why things didn't work. It's some other person that dropped the ball and didn't do their job. And a highly reflective leader generally figures out pretty quickly that while there probably were plenty of things that contributed to the lack of success, perhaps the single most important one was me, the leader. And what did I do or not do? What could I have done differently to set the right tone, to provide the right resources, to offer the right encouragement and guidance to people to more successfully execute on the change that we were trying to execute on. So reflection turns out to be an extraordinarily important element of the character and the behavior of successful leaders of transformational change.
Yeah. That's interesting. I asked that question deliberately because in some of my own formal qualitative research, I would say hands down with some of the transformational leaders, a primary, I think, attribute or character across the board was a very reflective nature. Just the ability to really reflect and ask questions and really learn from their experiences. So very, very interesting answer there, Ian. Thank you for that. But I would like to actually piggyback on that question in regards to a common denominator. One of your chapters is a compilation of great input from 150 people who have led transformational changes, been affected by them or both, as you'd previously mentioned, Ian. And your book shares that primary themes that emerged were, and you touched on a couple of these, but I'd like to repeat these for our listeners. But number one, go first, but not alone. Number two, define, align, and refine the what and why. And three, energize the village. Those were three primary themes that emerged throughout this work and stories from 150 people. So I'm going to save the meat and potatoes for our listeners, Ian, and they need to read your book. But please tell me more about the energizing the village piece, and what does that look like tactically?
Yeah, the energizing the village piece really comes back to this whole question of the hearts and minds of the human beings who have to drive and participate in the change. So, one of the things we say a number of different times in the book is leading transformational change takes a village. You're obviously not going to do it by yourself. But a big portion of leadership success and making it happen is creating the energy and the engagement that's required to bring these other people around. One of the contributors to the book described it as creating and promoting pull, so that you've got, individuals that, want to be part of the change and understand what is being asked of them, rather than having this, large, scary, complicated change pushed on them, and them trying to figure out, whether it's something that they should embrace or whether they should resist, with every fiber of their being. Now, a lot of people, always ask the question, is there any magic to creating that energy and engagement and excitement and making it fun? Because not all aspects of big change is fun. And there's no one magic bullet, but one consistency that comes through over and over again that seems to work better than most things is listen, and listen some more. I think a lot of times we talk about successful change. One of the big elements of success is communication, at its most generic level. What I worry about, even though communication, of course, is important, is when you talk about the importance of communication, people's heads almost always go to tell. Particularly if I'm a leader, I'm going to spend a lot of my time telling you about the compelling need for change and telling you about the facts and telling you about the data and telling you about all these things that require that we do things differently. And a certain amount of telling is important, but it needs to be far, far outweighed by listening, understanding from other people's perspectives at a variety of different levels in the organization, what's happening with the customer, what's happening with the external environment, what's happening with your employee base, and where the biggest obstacles are that need to be overcome and where the biggest hassles are that are getting in the way of people doing the best job that they can possibly do. All of that comes from listening. And it turns out if you're a great listener as a leader, that is unbelievably energizing and motivating to the people who are being heard, because in most cases, they feel like they haven't been heard for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think, Ian, listening to your response to my questions today and listening to the way that you describe effective leaders, transformational change leaders, I'm certainly picking up on two attributes. And one is this idea of empathy, leadership with empathy, and the other is just listening, right? Which I suppose in a way, good and active listening is a form of empathy. And there's been a lot of work. There's been a lot of research done that really demonstrates quite well that those are two pretty important attributes of transformational leaders, for sure.